Now welcome to session 2 of our workshop, of our full-scale workshop day. And
but are you seeing? Do we see you on the Zoom?
Yes,
Okay.
it is.
When you stand.
It is. I can see it. And
Okay, fine.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. Keep speaking.
And Martin also wants to stay, so I start with a short introduction. Dr. Martijn Lak from Utrecht. Okay. So it's he has studied, but your life is authentic. He studied journalism at Hogeschool Utrecht and history at Utrecht University. In 2011, he obtained his PhD thesis on the study of the Dutch-German economic and political relations between 1945 and 1957. Martin's research mainly focuses on the Second World War, military history, and Dutch-German relations. He regularly publishes in national and international journals, and he is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Slavic Military Studies. Currently, he is a postdoc at the University of Amsterdam, where he does research into the history of Jewish orphans, mainly orphans, in the post-1945 period. Martin is additionally, he is also a lecturer of political history at Radboud University in Nijmegen, and today we will talk to us on rehabilitation of Jewish children in the post-war Netherlands. Martin, welcome. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Olaf, for your kind words, and thank you for having me on this workshop. I need to give you a little bit of a warning. I only started on this project on the 1st of January 2024, so it's like only 43 days in progress. And of that first month, half was spent at Utrecht University, where I still had to do like 25 oral exams with my students. So it's really just in the beginning. But I want to speak to you about a case study of Jewish orphans in the post-war Netherlands. And this is my, but does it work? That's how it works. This is what I'm going to do today. So I first want to present you some contexts about the fate of Dutch Jewish orphans in the post-1945 period. I want to tell you something shortly about our project, because I'm not working on this alone. It's a cooperative project. And then a case study of two Jewish girls who went into hiding during the Second World War, and about their fate had to be decided after the Second World War because both of their parents had been murdered. So what to do with them in that case? This is what we are going to talk about, or this is what I'm going to talk about. This is a famous picture, at least it's a famous picture in the Netherlands, above all because of the girl in the middle in the white dress. Is this a leap of faith? She's the only girl who survived from this classroom of Jewish kids. And by chance, she wears this nice white dress. She's the only survivor. That's the thing we need to keep in the back of our minds when we study the fate of Dutch Jewish orphans after the Second World War, or of the persecution of Jews in the Netherlands, more generally speaking. Oh, it goes back. So, first of all, about the context. Are you familiar with the persecution of the Dutch Jews during the Second World War? And the very high number of Dutch Jews that was murdered during the Second World War. So these are around 75% of Dutch Jews was murdered. It's a far higher figure than in Belgium or in France for all sorts of reasons. One of them being that the Dutch had a civil administration instead of a military administration. And these civil servants were very eager to murder as many Jews as they could get their hands on. Still, some Dutch Jewish kids survived, around 4,000 of them. So the most of them had been into hiding, the majority of them with non-Jewish parents. So that's what you need to keep in the back of your mind. The problem was, or the difficulty was, that after the Second World War, it turned out that many of these kids no longer had any parents, or perhaps even no longer any relatives. Right? That's what you need to keep in the back of your mind. And then the question came up, okay, what to do with these kids? Right? And there were two main groups here: the former resistance in the Netherlands, so that's non-Jewish resistance, and the parents that had hidden kids on the one hand, and the decimated Jewish community on the other. What to do with these kids who had lost both their parents? Well, the former resistance and parents that had hidden their children generally wanted kids to return to their foster parents where they had been in hiding. So do not return them to the Jewish community. Moreover, especially the Dutch resistance was of the opinion that there should not be made any exemption for Jewish kids. They should be treated just like all other kids. Sounds perhaps like a sort of strange argument, but the argument of the resistance was, if we do that, we only emphasize the speciality of the Dutch, of the Jewish faith, and that may result in more anti-Semitism. Sort of a warped argumentation, but that is the line they follow. And also keep in the back of your mind, my friends, that the Jews that did return from the concentration camps in the Netherlands were not necessarily very welcome. That's also something to keep in the back of your mind. And the decimated community, on the other hand, wanted these Jewish kids to be sent to a Jewish relative. Another problem here is that the Jewish community was not in agreement here. So there was a strong distinction between, say, the more Orthodox, who basically said there is no future for the Jews in the Netherlands, so let's ship all these kids to Israel, and the more liberal part of the Jewish community, who was more of the intention of saying we need to keep them in the Netherlands. There is a future for us in the Netherlands, but we need to take care of them. And then the Dutch government is confronted with this question. I think you should keep in the back of your mind that in May 1945, when the Netherlands was liberated, or when Germany was liberated or occupied, depends on what position you take, it was chaos. It was utter chaos. So I'm not here to have any moral discussions on whether or not the Dutch government did well or whether or not it played a wrong role. It is just about analyzing what happened and how can we explain it. And to be able to explain it, we need to keep in mind that in May 1945, the Netherlands was in chaos. Not in an economic sense. Dutch did very well during the Second World War, actually, on the economic front, but culturally, politically, scientifically, infrastructurally, the Netherlands was in chaos. And amidst that chaos, the Dutch government had to do something for war orphans and as such for Jewish war orphans. Mind you, the Dutch government did not necessarily make a distinction between the two. Right? They were just about war orphans. And this led to the establishment of the Commissie Oorlogspleegkinderen, or OPK in short, which sort of translates as the Commission for War Orphans. And the problem with this OPK was that it didn't really function. It saw itself sort of as of a guardian saying, okay, you, Olaf, you're responsible for taking care of this Jewish kid. We are only supervising it. And Daniela, you also have some Jewish kids, and we're just supervising whether or not you do a good job. But to be able to say whether or not Daniela did a good job, they needed to master the dossiers themselves as well. So they played an important role. And when the OPK was abolished in 1949, I take very big steps here, otherwise I don't have enough time, many individual files still remained. And they were transferred to the so-called Voogdijraad, which is the Council of Custody, and they were individually decided on. Right? So the OPK only functioned for 4 or 5 years, and has been assessed very negatively in Dutch historiography, especially in Jewish circles, so to say. One of the most important players in this whole debate is Leesrat Hayelet. I hope I pronounce it correctly, which translates something as to the aid of the child. And their main goal was to give Jewish children a place in the Jewish community. How? Either with foster parents, so Jewish foster parents could be far distant relatives, or in Jewish orphanages. And you should take into account that of those 4,000 Dutch Jewish children, the majority did not end up in Jewish orphanages. Only a few hundred of them, right? The rest either went to their foster parents or went to their former hiding parents. Depends very much on the case. So that's the context in which we study this question. This smiling young man is Bart Wallet from the University of Amsterdam. He is the leader of the project. He publishes regularly on Jewish affairs in the Netherlands, and he is sort of a national celebrity at the moment because since October 7th, he has been on television almost daily. It's an interesting thing that in the Netherlands, when there is such a terrible thing has happened, you always see the same speakers. Right? So it's Bart, or it's someone from Utrecht University who's more on the Palestinian side, but Bart is regularly on television. So when I applied for this job, he was in the interview commission. I said, "Oh, nice to meet you." I said, "Sort of already know you because I saw you on television all the time." Our main project is focusing on, can we say something about how the financial assets of these Jewish orphans, how were they taken care of? Right? And you need to take into account that above a certain amount of money, say above 2,000 guilders, which translates something like 900 euros, something like that. that money could be used by these Jewish orphanages to pay for the children and their food, their housing, etc., etc. Right? So what happened to these financial assets? But we don't just want to look at finances. We also want to study the societal and social context in which these Jewish institutions acted. Right. So in a climate in which Jews were not necessarily very welcome. We just spoke about it, Verena. Many Dutch people have the idea of, don't complain, we also went through something terrible. We just had a hunger winter, don't complain, right? Or people returning home to their homes, finding out they had been taken over by the non-Jewish people and that they sort of had to rebuy their own house, right? So that is the situation in which they came back. Does that mean that the Dutch were very anti-Semitic? Not necessarily, but also not very tactful. So we want to look at those societal and social context. And we want to involve all actors, right? So those orphans still remaining. Mind you, most of them are over 80 years old nowadays. So either they are still mentally capable. On the 4th of March, I have an interview with a 93-year-old woman who is very, very capable mentally, but we also have those who have lost their memory, etc., etc. So we first need to find out how many are still alive, Dutch Jewish orphans. We want to interview guardians, the managers of these societal institutions, and also societal workers. So it's great to be here at this workshop in which that side of societal workers is also into the picture, that we understand sort of what you're doing, actually. Period is 1945 to the present day, and our overarching question is, how have Jewish guardian institutions controlled the assets of Jewish war orphans? Because in the Jewish community, there is the idea that these Jewish institutions didn't really take good care of the finances of these orphans. Right? So they used them, for example, to send kids to Palestine or to Israel and pay their trip, but also buying tractors for that money as well. So there is a discussion or a feeling in the Jewish community that the Jewish communities have not necessarily taken care of their Jewish orphans in a proper way. As I said, I only started on the 1st of January this year. I think the truth will be somewhere in the middle. Right? So does it mean that everything went well? No. Does it mean that everything went wrong? No. We will probably end up somewhere in the middle. And the problem is that many of these financial dossiers have been destroyed by Leesgat El Yelet. Right, and that to a lot of, especially those who emigrated to Palestine, that is a sign of saying that must mean that something was wrong. Whereas this is just Dutch law. After a certain period of time, you can destroy 90% of the archives. So it's just normal law. This project is supposed to take 2 years. And the first person I interviewed about this is doing a study into the OPK, which I just mentioned. You said that is ambitious. Do you have any idea how many files there are left? Well, hundreds, he said. Well, count on 1,300. And 1,300 times 40 to 60 pages. In 2 years' time, that's interesting. It took me 2 years just reading them, and I didn't even study the finances. So I went back to Bart and said, well, perhaps this is somewhat ambitious. He said, yeah, but we have the JMW, Joods Maatschappelijk Werk, so that's the societal work for Jews in the Netherlands, the only Jewish institution which everyone agrees, so to say, in the Netherlands. But they want it done quickly, precisely because many of these orphans are on a high age and might be gone in 2 years' time. So they are sort of in a hurry. That is in the background of our project. Now, let us then try to sort of make clear how this worked out in practice. So I present you a case study here, which is not sort of one I just recently discovered and hasn't been studied by anyone. This is a quite familiar case, especially in the Netherlands. And it shows you how difficult it was after 1945 to sort of get to an agreement on how to deal with those Dutch Jewish children that had lost both their parents, what to do with them. And that is the case of Anneke or Anna Beekman and Rebecca or Betty Melgado or Melgado. It's probably from a Portuguese background. As you can see, they were born just prior to the Second World War. Anna in 1939 and Betty in 1940. Betty in 1940. And what is so interesting about this case is that you immediately see the difference in the Dutch community here between those who were of a more orthodox leaning and those who were far more liberal and were not practicing at all. Both these kids went into hiding on the initiative of the parents. Take into account that it took long in the Netherlands for resistance to develop. Only in 1943 does it really start. And not because of the fate of the Jews, but because of the Arbeidseinsatz. I hope that rings a bell, but this was the idea that Dutch young men could be taken to Germany to work forcibly in factories, and only then does the resistance in the Netherlands really kick off. For most Jews, you could say that it's too late. By that date, so in 1943, most Jews have already been deported to Auschwitz and Sobibor and murdered en masse, right? But these two kids, they were in time. And the Netherlands is not really a suitable country to hide people in. I hope you can see that. We don't have any mountains. We have a lot of water. That is a preference, but it's difficult. And for a long time, there was no system to be able to put these people into hiding. Both parents were murdered. And then the question becomes what to do. Right? And as soon as the war ends, this discussion starts. Now, what is their situation? For Anneke, she still had two cousins that were alive. And these two cousins advocated that Anneke was sent to death. Right? Because they were relatives and they thought that Anneke should return to death. There was a problem, however, from 2 points, so to say. So where Anneke was in hiding, her parents were Catholic. And it was suggested that the former parents of Anneke would not have favored a Catholic upbringing. There was another problem, and I hope you can see why that was a problem, that Anneke lived with two ladies under the same roof. So to a certain extent, that suggested there might be some lesbian relationship between the two, and the question was whether or not it's good for an upbringing. As Catholics, that's surprising that women can live together, by the way, in that day and age. Both were unmarried and staunch Catholic, and they wanted to baptize Anneke, so bring her into the Catholic community. To a certain extent, the same applied to Rebecca. She also had a living relative, a great aunt, and she also was willing to take Rebecca in her house. Now, I already introduced you the OPK, and they had to assess whether or not these parents or multiple parents were able to sort of take care of these kids in a proper way. And the OPK basically said, well, both families are unsuitable. One is unsuitable because they were living in a very cramped house, I think something that a surface like this, and the other is because they were not really deemed to make a so-called motherly impression. And a motherly impression in the Netherlands, especially in 1945, is very important, very religious. And if a mother doesn't really function or shows herself to be a mother, then they are not really necessarily good foster parents. Another reason not to say that these were suitable parents was that they were told they were either too young, there's a spelling mistake here, or they were too old. So what to do now? And Leesrat also came into the picture here. And they said, well, and that is what I already showed you, Anneke should be placed with her Jewish guardians. The problem is that Anneke was never actually asked what she wanted. But it turned out that she felt at home with these so-called Van Moors women and wanted to stay there. What is the solution? Perhaps a typically Dutch solution. Give custody to Leesrat. Seems like a suitable solution, but the story becomes much more interesting now. Both Anneke and Rebecca were kidnapped, so to say. Once they were illegally transferred across the border with Belgium by their foster parents. They were hidden in a monastery and were only discovered in 1953. Right, so this led to a huge public debate and public outcry in the Netherlands. Where are these kids? But this showed you that it was not just about Leesrat, but also about the former hiding parents that thought themselves to be entitled to these kids. You could make a certain claim to that, but they took them to Belgium. In 1953, Rebecca was now called Betsy van Laar. Betsy is much more Dutch than Rebecca, of course. She was discovered and returned back to Leesrat, and then she sort of disappears from the radar. Never to hear from her again. Anneke's case is even more remarkable because she went to a new hiding place after 1953 in France. There she met a Dutchman, who she married in Hilversum, which is close to where I live. And that case only ended in 1961 when she came of age. And when orphans come of age, these institutions no longer have any say about them. So I hope you can see the complexity of these cases. So what does it tell us? Well, this is an obvious one. As an understatement, the care for Jewish orphans was very complex, precisely because so many groups and individuals were involved. There was a fierce battle between the non-Jewish community and the Jewish community. I think both acted from an idea that they were taking care of the interests of their kids. So they were not doing something wrong morally, I would say. They thought what they did was right. And the main problem here is, I think, the interests of the orphans themselves were not taken into account. Because the OPK had one leading statement. So if the parents have left any note or any signal or any suggestion of what should happen to their kids if the parents were to die, that was always leading. I will give you one more case, and I will keep it anonymously. This is the case of two parents who were already in hiding, but the woman is pregnant. What they do, they go in a clandestine way to go to a hospital somewhere in the east of the Netherlands, and they give birth to this kid. And they go into hiding again, eventually being discovered and murdered. But the mother leaves a note. The mother leaves a note saying, if we are to die, my kids should go to their aunt in Switzerland. The note survives. Right? So OPK says, oh, there's a note. Oh, this is the wish of the parents. This is what needs to happen. So they contact the aunt in Switzerland, who has no idea, but out of a feeling of, how do you call it, the feeling that you need to do this, she accepts it. Is she really wanting this? Not really. Does her husband feel comfortable with this? Not at all. But out of a feeling of not guilt, but of feeling of obligation. Thank you, Boaz. They take her into their house, but they never ever ask that boy what he wants. And if you look into the file of this person, it is one long hell of psychiatric problems, problems in the upbringing, because he was never asked. No, but this was leading, so that's what also something we should take into account, that you can have relatives, but what if you don't know them and all of a sudden you're brought under their custody? So this is a complex question, so to say, after, say, 30 days in studying it. Thank you for your attention, and I will be taking questions later.